All right, folks, welcome back into the Museum of Glass here on the Hop Shop floor after lunch. This morning we started out by making some stoppers, if you will, for these blue decanters. We've got a couple of examples here on our lighted platforms. They're going to be used for an event later on in the year, and the event, the design that they were going for is a dragon-style form that serves as that stopper for that decanter. You see what we're going to continue working with this afternoon, probably more of the same. And in much the same way we started this morning, we start out with a gather or a small glob of clear hot glass on the end of one of our solid rods called a punty rod. Currently, we have Ben sitting here at the marvering table, letting that initial gather set up, gives it a little more structural rigidity, presents a little bit more surface area for the glass to hold on to once we get back into that crucible, gives us a little bit more to work with. So we open that door of the crucible. That crucible runs at about 2,100 degrees, 24/7. We never shut it off. And if you contrast that or compare that to the large open orange holes that we have, we refer to those as G holes or rewarming stations. The difference between those and the crucibles is that there is no glass inside those G holes, and they run at about 200 degrees hotter, so about 2,300 degrees internal temperature. They hold no glass on the inside, save for what falls off the end of our pipes and our rods. They run, as I said, on forced air and natural gas. These are different than our crucibles in that our crucibles run 24/7, and these rewarming stations only run while we're here in the hot shop. What we're doing with our glass form now is we have added a second layer of clear glass to the outside. We've dipped it in that small silver bowl on our marvering table. That bowl holds chipped up golden colored glass called frit. We roll it through there, it sticks to the surface of our glass, and then we put it back into that rewarming chamber. It gets everything nice and hot and liquidy, bonds everything together. We've taken that hot, liquidy, now golden colored glass, put it into an optic mold, which leaves behind some embossed texture, if you will, in the surface of our glass form. And then using a selection of metal tools that we have there at our bench. In this particular case, that tool there he's using is called the jacks. Begin to shape up, elongate, and draw out the body of our dragon form into something more serpentine. And when Ben is happy with the shape and dimensions of that particular portion of our dragon form, we get it into the rewarming chamber, make it nice and hot so the outside will stick to this wrap that we're about to add. A very thin wrap of clear glass. That way when our form is finished, the surface will read as dragon scales rather than just a shiny piece of glass. All right, with the addition of that wrap, we're going to get back deep into that rewarming chamber and make sure all of that newly added thread melts into the surface of our dragon form. And once Ben is happy with the condition of that, we'll get it back into the center bench where we'll continue using those metal tools to shape it up and bring it more in line with what the artist has in mind. Folks, if you have any questions about the process, what's going on the floor, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll come over to you and I'll answer whatever question you have. If I can't answer it, I'll find somebody that can. All right, so we've got that tail twisted up into a nice coil. While we're inside that rewarming chamber, we've got one of our interns taking a trip through that glass frit we talked about. Again, it's just colored glass that's been chunked up into little tiny chips. And then we roll our hot glass through that. The hot glass heats up the very edges of that chipped up glass. It allows it to bind. Then we get it deep into that rewarming chamber, which liquefies it, bonds it to the surface, makes a nice all over color. And then we add that little bit, shear it away, and then with our tongs and tools there on the side bench, we shape that up into the fins for the tail of our dragon. All right, Eden is going back into that crucible, gathering another layer of clear glass. Just going to bring it to the center bench and present it. We'll add a small dollop of clear glass to the bottom of this dragon form, so we have some more meat on the bones when we get to adding our punty pipe to the bottom of this, or a punty rod rather. What we're getting ready to do now is move this dragon form from the rod on which it sits to a new rod so that we can continue working on the wings, chest, and head of this dragon form. So we're creating that little punty. It will be attached to the bottom. Once our artist is comfortable with the manner in which that has stuck, we'll give us a quick tap across the edge of the rails of that chair, breaking it away from his rod, leaving it on our interns. And then we'll then get that back into the rewarming chamber, heating up the coldest portion of the glass, and continue working and shaping it up. So when you're working on these glass objects, the closest portion of that glass to the artist is often the coldest. In this particular case, that is 100% true. And in switching directions, moving that object to a different punty rod, as I said, gives us access to the head, chest, and other areas of this dragon we can work on. But because it was the coldest thing before we broke off, we have to bring it up to a good workable temperature so that other hot glass will stick to it. And that's what we're doing now, spending a little extra time in that rewarming chamber, making sure everything is up to temperature. So here at the bench, Ben has bent that neck over in preparation for another bit being added. We're going to avoid the face right now and go with a different portion. In this particular case, I'm going to pull all of the excess away, leaving us just a tiny little thread that we'll attach at the dragon's shoulder, and pull down to its elbow, and then away from the body slightly, leaving behind a tag that we can then turn into one of its claws. Get that back into the rewarming chamber. Get another all-over flash, keeping our form above 1,000 degrees. It's very important we do that. Then we'll get back to the bench and continue shaping up. You'll see another bit very shortly presented in much the same way to add the arm on the opposite side of the dragon. So there we have Nick going into that crucible. Again, 2,100 degrees, keeping all of our glass in a molten state 24/7. And then he takes that gather of glass, runs it through our chipped up yellow colored frit, and then melts it into the surface of the gather he just picked up. And then when Ben at the center bench is ready, we pull that bit, move the excess again, giving us a nice thread to attach to the shoulder, then the elbow, then back up to the wrist with another tag for the claw. And then back into the rewarming chamber to keep everything nice and hot and workable. And if we hold true to form from this morning, we're going to be adding the mane of the dragon right down the back of its neck. Snip that away with the shears, and then a little attention with the tongs to add some design elements into it. And we'll get it back into that rewarming chamber, make sure it stays nice and hot and ready to go. And got another bit added to make the face of the dragon. All right, and here on the left-hand side of the studio, we have this big silver box. We call this our garage. Our garage, just like your garage at home, holds all our extra pieces and parts and project stuff. We'll be going in here, removing a tray that is currently sitting with some eyeballs that were made previously. We're going to be attaching those here very soon. But hot glass really only likes to stick to other hot things. So in order for us to be able to apply these eyeballs to this dragon form, we have to get them up to about 1,000 degrees. So that's why we've got it here in our garage. The internal temperature on the left-hand side sits at about 1,000. The temperature on the right-hand side, which we call the hot side, is usually about 300 to 400 degrees hotter. So we'll move it from the left side in the ready state to the right side for a minute or two, get it nice and warm. Then we'll present it here back at the center bench where we'll roll our dragon's face into that, adding the eyeball elements very shortly. All right, with the addition of those eyeballs and getting back deep into that room warming chamber, Ben here at the center bench has made sure that the connection between those two pieces is 100% secure. We certainly don't want to lose it during the cooling process. We're making sure that everything is 100% ready to go onto our next stage. We have a couple more design elements to add here, a couple of wings and whatnot. We'll see those added over the next few minutes before we get ready to put this piece away for the afternoon. All right, so we've got the initial form of the first wing attached to the dragon body. Make a trip to the rewarming station to heat up the glass we just cooled down with those tongs. And then we'll use our tweezers to pull it out just a little bit more. Give it a little more artistic flair before we move on to the next addition. You know, those metal tools there on the side table are very cold. And so once we have used those tongs to emboss the surface of that wing form, we've got to get it back into the rewarming chamber, give us that nice all-over flash to the skin of our dragon form. That way we can tweeze it out and pull it into something a little more pointy, a little more aesthetically pleasing. And then we get it back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over flash, getting ready to do the final touches before we put it away for the afternoon. As I mentioned earlier, here in the garage on the left-hand side of the studio, we keep all of our extra parts. We have all of our dragon forms that we made this morning. So we have our dragon forms that we set up this morning. They're currently in there. Again, they're in a ready state. At about 1,000 degrees, that glass will stop moving, but it still keeps it nice and hot so that if we do and when we do need it, it's only a matter of moments before it comes up to a workable temperature. So if you guys want to take a quick look at the dragon form. All right, using that MAP gas torch, pay a little more attention to that moil, that connection point between our rod and our glass form. Making sure that it is up to temperature so that when we get ready to break this item away from the rod it sits on, put it in the tray and away for the evening, we get a nice clean break. One more all-over flash to the skin of the object before we put it away, making sure that it is as uniformly heated as possible. And we'll use those shears to create some cracks, little chomp marks there at the constriction at the end of that pipe. And with a quick tap, we'll leave it in that tray, and Nick will put it in the garage, as I said. About 1,000 degrees is enough to keep that glass hot and ready, but not so hot that it will deform once it gets inside there. So we'll put that away until we get ready to use it a little bit later. And in much the same way as we began this last object, we're starting the next one. A small gather of clear glass on the end of a solid rod. We'll roll it back and forth across that stainless steel table called the Marver. And we let it set up just a bit before we put it into that crucible and add another layer of clear hot glass on the outside. A nice thick gather of glass. We'll roll it through that golden chipped up colored, yellow colored glass we've got there on the table. Call that frit. Once we have a sufficient coating of frit, we get it back into the rewarming station. Make sure that all of that newly added glass melts into the surface. And once Ben is happy with the condition of that, we'll throw that entire glob of glass into an optic mold. Again, embossing the surface of that glass, giving us some striations up and down the length of what will become our dragon's body. Get it back into that rewarming chamber for another heat to the skin since we cooled it off by throwing it in that metal form. And now we've got it back to the bench. We can use our metal tools, tweezers, tongs, and these bladed tools that are going to be coming up next called the jacks. We'll set those constrictions, the basic geometry, and stretch out the body of our dragon form. All right, so we've now got the basic geometry for our initial run set up. We're going to move over to this contraption we've set up here in the front of the studio. We can add a wrap to the outside. Once we get that wrap added and have everything melted in, it'll read much more as a scaly dragon than it does right now. All right, and then away from that wrap into the rewarming station to make sure that all of that hard work that we just did actually bonds to the surface below it. And once we're happy with the amount of thermal energy in our dragon form, we'll get back to the bench and continue shaping. In much the same way as we did our last dragon form, we're now creating a curly little tail. And bend that around, attach it to itself, and get ready for the addition of the next bit, which will be added there to that tail. Using a pair of shears, we will split it apart, turn it into some tail fins right before we get ready to knock this piece off and put it on another rod so we can work on the head. So we've got that bit, just came out of the crucible, took a trip through the frit in that bowl on the table, and now into the rewarming station to melt all of the frit into the surface. And then we'll present that back here at the bench so we can turn that bit into those tail fins that I just talked about. All right, so we've got Eden, one of our interns, in that crucible, getting us a nice little tiny gather of hot clear glass. We're going to add that to the bottom of the tail. Give us a little bit more meat on the bones to protect that dragon form once we get ready to knock it away and put it on our other punty rod. So we're getting ready to work on the upper portion, the head, face, and chest of this dragon. In order to do so, we need to attach a new rod to the bottom so the top becomes accessible. So that's what we're doing here. We're creating that rod. We'll stick that to the bottom. And Ben here in our center bench, once he's happy with the way in which it's stuck, he uses metal tools and a quick tap on the pipe on which he's holding. It'll break that away and leave it with our intern. Then we'll get it back into the rewarming chamber and continue shaping up and refining that dragon form. There's your tap, and away it goes. So the portion that is furthest from the artist or deepest in that rewarming station as it sits right now is also the coldest piece of glass, because previously it was the last thing in and the first thing out. So in order for us to make this dragon form into what we know it should be, we've got to heat up the end of that dragon form so we can then continue adding bits to the outside of it. So we're going to spend a little bit longer gathering heat than we normally would, just to bring that cold portion up to temperature. Once Ben's happy with the temperature and the way things are moving on the inside, we'll get back to the bench and continue shaping up and adding those bits and pieces that will make the dragon really read as a dragon. So there's the initial steps of bending that neck over. In doing so, that gives us access to a couple of other places that will work. Looks like we're going to be adding the arms next. So Nick is going to go into that crucible, pick up a little bit of clear glass. We're going to dip it in that bowl on the table. Again, that's called frit, chipped up colored glass. And then we get into the rewarming station, heat up all that freshly added glass, melt it into the surface, and then we come back and present it. We use those shears to pull away the excess, giving us a nice little thread that we can then attach to the shoulder. We'll drop it down to the elbow and then back up again, and then leave a small tag that we can turn into the dragon's claw a little bit later. Just like we did a minute ago, we've got a gather of glass. We rolled it in that frit, heating it all up so it gets liquidy and covers that outside of the gather. And then we draw it off, cut away the excess, and then apply from the shoulder to the elbow, back up to the wrist. And just like before, get back in that 2,300 degree rewarming chamber for another all-over heat to the skin of our dragon form. All right, little dialogue between the center bench and the crucible. Gonna make the colored bit that we're going to add to the dragon's neck as its mane. So we've got that frit on the outside of our clear glass, nice and melty. We present it back here, up the back of the dragon's neck, and with our tongs, we add those sculptural elements. And we get it right back into the rewarming chamber for another all-over heat. All right, out of the rewarming chamber, back to the bench. I'm going to continue working those design elements while our intern rolls another gather of clear glass through that colored frit. We'll melt it into the surface and then present it back here at the bench where we'll add the face of our dragon form. All right, with those initial design elements built in, we get it back into the rewarming chamber for another all-over heat to the skin of our object. Now here on the left-hand side, we've got Nick going into our big silver box called the garage. I'm gonna pull out a tray. It's got previously made dragon's eyeballs on it. Not quite ready for it here at the center bench. Gonna add a couple more design elements, probably get it back in that rewarming chamber at least one more time. Very carefully, using that MAP gas torch, we're continuing to heat up those eyeballs on the tray. Hot glass likes to stick to other things, so we've got to heat them up, bring them up to a reasonable temperature that they stick together. Then we get them back into that rewarming chamber to make sure that that bond is secure before we move on to the rest of the design elements. Right there at the marvering table, we've got Eden taking another run through that gold-colored frit and melting it into the surface of her gather, and then presenting it here at the center bench. And we'll add that initial wing form and get the first design elements put in it before we run back to that rewarming station and heat the whole thing up again. So those cold tools do chill the surface of that glass, and in order to get the design that we're looking for, we've got to make sure that they're a little bit warmer than that. We can tweeze the tip up, make it a little more aesthetically pleasing and less chunky. And in preparation for the next wing, we have Eden again with that gather of clear glass rolled through that gold-colored frit, now heating it up, getting it all nice and melted into the surface so we can present it and add wing number 2. Folks, if this just isn't quite enough glass blowing for you in one day, the museum every third Thursday of the month runs an event from 5 to 8 p.m. here in the Hot Shop. It is free admission. We'll be showcasing the Hilltop artists from the Hilltop Artist Program here in the Tacoma area. In addition to that, we will be having a concert in the Cone from 6 to 7. Free admission again. So please check with the front desk, get those tickets, and we'll see you back here this afternoon, a little bit later. Quick run by the audience so everyone can see what we're working on. And again, folks, that cools off super fast. So we're going to get it back in that rewarming chamber for a nice all-over flash. Try and bring it up and equalize the thermal temperature of the entire skin of our object. Once Ben is happy with the temperature of that, we'll get it put away in this big silver box called our garage, where it will sit for the remainder of the afternoon. Use that MAP gas torch, apply a little thermal energy to the connection point between our punty rod and our dragon form. It'll make it a little easier for us to break this piece away and leave it in the tray that we're going to put away for the evening. All right, really crunching down on that constriction point. You've got Nick coming back with the tray. A quick tap on the end of that rod will separate the dragon form. And then, like I said, we're going to put it away in our garage, this big silver box, where it will sit in a ready state until we get ready to use it later on. The internal temperature of that garage sits at about 1,000 degrees on the left-hand side, 1,400 degrees on the right. And we put our glass objects in there to keep them in a ready state, but not liquid state. So the glass will be nice and hot, but not hot enough to move. It will stay there until we're ready to use it. In much the same way as we began our last dragon form, we start this one with a gather of hot clear glass on the end of a solid rod. Trimming away a little bit of the excess there. And then down into that optic mold where it will create a nice striped or striated surface texture. And then back into the rewarming chamber for another all-over heat, and another, as we call it, a flash. And then back to the center bench where we'll continue to shape up and start imparting our design elements into this dragon form. You can see Ben is using that bladed tool called the Jax, one of the most commonly used tools. And then using the selection of tongs and shears, we're going to pull that object out, lengthen it up, make it more serpentine. Something a lot easier to bend and twist into that dragon form. All right, we're preparing to add a wrap around the outside of this entire dragon's body. We've set up these wheels here in the front so we can showcase that. Quick tap with some hot glass on the very edge. We're going to draw it back into a tiny thread, and then we'll roll that pipe through those wrap rollers. And then we get the entire thing back into the rewarming chamber to make sure that that thread that we added to the outside now melts into the surface of our dragon's body. As I mentioned earlier, today is third Thursday here at the Museum of Glass. We will be running an event this afternoon, evening, from 5 to 8. We have the Hilltop artists coming in and presenting a glass demonstration from 5 to 8 p.m. It is free of charge. In addition to that, we have a kora player. His name is Sean Gaskell, who will be joining us this evening for a concert in the Cone. Now, the kora is a 21-stringed West African harp. It's traditionally played by oral historians known as griots, and many songs featured on the kora preserve an 800-year history dating back to the founding of the Mande Empire. Gaskell will be performing in the Hot Shop, accompanied by live glass blowing by the Hilltop artists. The museum will be hosting a special Museum of Glass member exclusive lounge from 5 to 6 p.m. featuring snacks and drinks. If you're interested in becoming a museum member, please stop by the visitor service desk for more information. Good. Now that we've got the first real design element of this dragon form sculpted in that we've got the curly tail twisted around. We've got Eden working on another bit of colored glass. It will be presented at the center bench, and then that bit will be turned into the tail fins of the dragon form on which we're working. Got another glob of clear glass coming out of that crucible. Going to be adding that glass to the bottom of this dragon's tail. Gives us a little bit more glass on the end of that object to protect it when we get ready to break it away from the punty rod on which it will reside. This is a good indicator that we're coming to that point and getting ready to do a punty transfer. So we're going to move it from this rod onto another one so that we can continue to work on the dragon form. This time we'll be focusing on the upper portion of the upper body of it, the wings, chest, arms, face, etc. But before we do that, we've got to break this object away from the rod it sits on so we have access to the opposite end. We've got a quick attachment here, making sure that everything is joined up nice and neat. A quick chomp of those shears and a tap of the rod will leave it in our intern's hands. We get back into that rewarming chamber. Heat up the coldest portion of the glass now, bringing it up to temperature so that we can continue to shape it up and bring it more in line with that dragon form that we have in our vision. So we're trimming away the excess, bringing that hot glass down to almost a thread. Gives us a nice, very small bit to add to the shoulder. Drag it down to the elbow and then back up to the wrist where we trim it away, leaving a little bit of an excess tag there so we can turn that tag into the dragon's claw. And get that back to the bench and we'll refine that shape a little bit more. At the same time that's happening, we've got Nick who's going to be going back into that crucible, picking up another gather of hot glass. And in much the same way as we've seen, we're going to continue to run these pieces through that chipped up golden glass called frit. And get it into the rewarming chamber so all of that new frit melts into the surface. And then we'll present it back here at the center bench for the addition of that arm and claw. All right, so we've gotten the arms and claws added. We've added the mane to the back of the neck. It looks like we're getting ready to add the face here. So another bit of colored glass. Smooshed on, a little trim. And we'll continue to shape that up with our tongs. Now, while we've got our center bench putting the finishing touches on the face of this dragon, we've got Nick here on the left-hand side of the studio in front of this big silver box called the garage. Nick is currently heating up a couple of eyeballs to be added to the dragon's face. And because hot glass really only likes to stick to other hot things, we have to bring these eyeballs up to a nice workable temperature so that everything sticks together and bonds perfectly. So using that MAP gas torch to bring those eyeballs up very delicately to a working temperature. Tap those in place. Now, once we're happy with that bond, we'll get it back into the rewarming chamber to make sure that everything melts together. We get it back to that center bench and continue adding those design elements. Got a couple of wings to go. In addition to making sure that everything looks aesthetically pleasing before we get ready and knock this piece away. So we've gotten the first of 2 wings added. We used those tongs to give us our initial shape of that wing. And because that metal is so cold, it chilled the surface of that glass to the point where we have to get it back into the rewarming chamber so we can continue to shape it, tweeze it out a little bit more before we add our second wing to the opposite side. Back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over flash heat. Back to the bench where we continue working. All right, folks, so we've got the main body of the dragon form pulled out, teased out, and now we are wrapping it with a horizontal wrap of clear glass. We get that into the rewarming chamber, and all of that glass has melted into the surface of our dragon form. It will look much more like the scales of a dragon. And then in the meantime, we have to move our dragon form into that rewarming chamber, making sure that all of that wrap that we added has then fused to the surface. And get it into a nice working temperature so the glass is moving at the end of that rod. And tweeze it out just a bit and continue shaping it up. Folks, for those of you who are just joining us here in the hot shop or joining us online, tonight is the third Thursday of the month here at the Museum of Glass. And in accordance with the museum's program, we'll be running a free event this evening called Third Thursday. It goes from 5 o'clock till 8 p.m. We'll be bringing in and showcasing the work of the artists from the Hilltop Artist Program. In addition to that, we will also be having a concert in the Cone. As you can see on the ledge in front of you, we're setting up for that concert. Today we will be featuring our kora player, Sean Gaskell. The kora is a 21-stringed African harp traditionally played by oral historians known as griots. And many songs featured on the kora preserve an 800-year history dating back to the founding of the Mende Empire. Gaskell will be performing in the hot shop, accompanied by live glass blowing by the Hilltop artists. The museum will be hosting a special Museum of Glass member-exclusive lounge from 5 to 6, featuring snacks and drinks. If you're interested in becoming a Museum of Glass member, stop by the visitor service desk for more information or sign up online at themuseumofglass.org. This will be a multi-sensory experience not to be missed, fun for all ages, and free with support from Tacoma Creates. So we have now twisted up the tail of our dragon form and added a new bit of colored glass. We snipped it into two separate pieces. And using some tongs, we're going to flatten those out into something that looks a lot more like tail fins before we get it back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over flash heat. Now we're getting ready to move this dragon form from the punty rod on which it sits to a new one. Before we do that, we have to add a little extra layer of clear glass to the bottom of the tail to make sure that the sculptural form is safe when we get ready to break it away from this punty rod. So we've got Eden in the crucible, picking up a gather of clear glass. We'll present it back here at the center bench. We add that little glob of clear right to the bottom. And with that, we'll get our form back into the rewarming chamber while we shape up the punty rod. onto which it will be transferred. You see that here at the center bench. We're going to tack one rod to the end of the tail, and with our shears, we're going to chomp, chomp, chomp through that little constriction off the end of the rod, and with a quick tap, those cracks will go all the way through the constriction and leave it on the punty rod with our intern. Looks like a good attachment there. And chomp, 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 and a quick tap. And now we put the coldest portion of the glass deepest into that rewarming chamber so that we can continue to work on the upper portion of that with the addition of the arms, wings, and face. And let's not forget the mane on the back of the neck. So because the neck of that dragon form is the coldest portion, we've got to keep it in the heat a little bit longer than we normally would. Bring it up from that ready temperature to a workable temperature. And when it's nice and orange and starts to get floppy, Ben will move from that rewarming station back to the bench and continue to shape up that dragon form. Tweezing and trimming away the excess so we have almost a thread to attach. And we'll start at the shoulder of the dragon, go down to the elbow, if you will, then back up to the claw, and trim it away. And then we'll form that extra little tag that we left over into the claw shape. All right, folks, we have now added both of the arms and the mane to our dragon's neck. I'm gonna get ready to add the face, sculpt that up, and then we'll add the wings to finish off. Before we get to that place, though, we've got to make sure that our dragon form is just as our artists want to see it. Work through the refinement of this design here at the bench before we start adding more pieces. So we're finishing the design on the head of our dragon, but what it lacks is a couple of eyeballs. And because hot glass only likes to stick to other hot things, we have heated up those eyeballs in this big silver box to my left-hand side called our garage. Use that MAP gas torch to focus some very targeted heat energy right into the face of our dragon while we pick up those eyeballs. And once we've successfully gotten them off the tray, we put the entire thing back into that rewarming chamber, make sure everything melts in and the bond between the two pieces is perfect. All right, so mane, claws, tail, and head. But what we lack now is the wings. So we're going to refine this just a bit more, and then we're going to start adding those wings to the outside of this dragon form. So we've got Eden going deep into that crucible. A crucible holds 1,000 pounds of glass at 2,100 degrees, 24/7. We've got two of those crucibles here on the floor, but the one here on the left side is not currently working. We're replacing it now. And when we're up and running at full speed, we have a ton of liquid glass at any given time to work with. If you contrast that with those big orange fiery holes that you see in front of us, the G holes or the rewarming station, those run at 2,300 degrees and only run while we're here in studio. We've added our first of two wings. Using those tongs, we emboss some of the surface texture into it. Now those metal tools chill off the surface of that glass very, very quickly, so we've got to get it back into the rewarming chamber. Re-loosen or loosen up the surface of that wing so that we can tweeze it out a little bit more. And folks, since there are so many new additions to the audience, let's see if we can talk our gaffer into walking around and showing the audience this dragon form before we get ready to put it away. Get a little bit closer view of what we're working on here. Now, when this does go away for the evening, we're going to be putting it into this big silver box on the left-hand side of the studio called our garage. That garage will hold our glass forms in a ready state at about 1,000 degrees, which means that the glass is hot enough to stay ready, but not hot enough that it will deform under its own weight and pressure. We keep it in that ready state so that we can use it later on without having to bring it from 0 up to a workable temperature. And you notice our artist there on the bench is paying very close attention to the connection point between our punty rod and our glass form. We've got to keep that connection above 1,000 degrees or we risk having it crack and losing all of our work. So, as I'd like to lean forward and take a look at what we've been working on. Those are those dragon forms, similar to the one that you see over here on the left-hand side of the studio, acting as a stopper for our decanter bottles that will be auctioned off later this year. And with that quick walk around, we're back into the rewarming chamber for another all-over flash heat to equalize that temperature before we get ready to put it away for the evening. The question was asked, what color will it be when it cools down? Much like the goblets that you see here in front of you, and if you're on the left-hand side of the studio, we have one dragon stopper. It will be that gold color after everything cools down and we've finished polishing. All right, so that's a third dragon form back in our box for the evening. I'm going to go ahead and start another one the same way we did last time. We'll start with a gather of clear glass on the end of a solid rod. We draw it out kind of into a little bit of a bar so we have extra surface area for the glass in our crucible to latch onto. We've gone into the crucible, added another layer of clear glass to the outside. And then after we've rolled it in our chipped up colored glass called frit, we move back to the rewarming station, make sure all of that frit has melted into the surface, and then we'll drop that entire thing into an optic mold, pull it out, and you can see that we have now embossed striations or lines into the body of what will become our dragon form. We get it back into the rewarming chamber, make sure that the skin of that object is still hot and malleable, and then using a selection of those metal tools on our side bench, we will pull that form out. We'll elongate things, create constrictions like you're seeing with the jacks here. And one very important part of this, we want to make sure that when we start our next portion of this design, that the form that we're working on now turns on the same axis. Got to make sure that it spins very, very smoothly because we're getting ready to add a wrap of clear glass to the outside, which when cool will read a lot more like dragon scales than if we were not to put it on there. So we're going to throw that initial form deep into the rewarming chamber. One of our interns pulls a glob of clear glass out of our crucible. And the next step will be to move back here to this little wheelie contraption. Tag it very lightly to the glass, pull back just a bit, and spin, spin, spin. Adding that wrap to the outside. And with that, we get it back into the rewarming chamber where we'll melt that new wrap into the surface of the dragon form on which we've been working. All right, so we'll be adding the first of many little bits to our dragon form. In this particular case, we'll be running a gather of hot glass again through that frit bowl on the table. That'll give us the color that'll match the outside of our dragon. And with that roll through the frit, we get it back into the rewarming chamber to melt all of that new glass into the surface. And when Ben is ready, he'll call for that bit to be added, bring it back to the bench, and we will turn that additional bit into tail fins. And now what we're doing is adding a small dollop of clear glass to the tail of our dragon form. This is give us a little extra meat on those bones, if you will, when we get ready to attach a punty rod to the bottom and separate this dragon form from the rod on which it sits, leaving it with our intern, so that we can then work on the head, chest, and upper body of this dragon. We get ready to break this piece away. We'll see our artist in the bench use his shears to chomp down on that little constriction just on the far side of his pipe. And with a quick tap, he will leave it on the pipe of our intern. So here we go, crunch, 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 a little tap, and then back into that rewarming chamber. Now, the portion of the glass that is furthest in that rewarming chamber is the coldest because it was just the furthest one out. We've inverted it, and now we have to bring it from that ready temperature up to a working temperature. So we'll spend a little bit extra time in there, making sure that we have all the thermal energy we need, ensure that that neck is nice and hot and malleable, and then we'll sit down at the bench and continue to shape it up, adding bits into what will become our dragon form. All right, so the next bit we're going to be adding is the arm. I'm going to trim away the excess, bringing it down to just a little bit of a thin filament. Attach that shoulder, the elbow, and then back up to the wrist. We'll turn the other little tag end into a dragon's claw. First of two. Then back into that rewarming chamber to make sure that everything stays above 1,000 degrees so we don't lose our work. Again, tweezing away the excess, trimming it off, adding arm number 2, shoulder elbow back to the wrist. And then again, back to that 2,300 degree rewarming chamber, making sure that the skin of our form is as uniform as possible, and that the area on which we're working is up to temperature so that we can continue to add bits and move it around, bring it more in line with our artist's vision. With those arms added, we'll take another gather of hot glass from that crucible, run it through our colored frit there on the table, make sure it's nice and melted in, and then we'll present it here at the center bench, where we will create the dragon's mane. From the base of the neck up to the crown, and then we use our tongs to add some more design elements to the outside of that. And straight back to the rewarming chamber to keep it above that critical temperature. All right, folks, with that bit, we have now added the tail. We've got the arms in place, the mane down the neck, and now the face is being worked into place. One of the things that our dragon lacks but really needs is a set of eyeballs. So here in the next minute or two, we're going to have those eyeballs presented at the center bench. They're currently being stored in this big silver box here to my left-hand side called the garage. Those pieces of glass are sitting in that garage at a ready state, about 1,000 degrees, 1,200 degrees, ready to be attached. Now they're nice and solid, but they're very sticky. So we use that MAPP gas torch, give us a little more thermal energy, make sure that everything is nice and hot. Dab our dragon's head down onto those eyeballs. And once we are happy with how well they're stuck, you get it back into that rewarming chamber. Make sure that everything melts together and creates a perfect bond. And that bit there is the addition of wing number 1 with our first shaping of that wing. Those metal tools chill the glass very, very quickly, so we've got to get it back into that rewarming chamber, make sure that the skin comes back up to temperature so that we can continue to tweeze out the end of this wing into something more aesthetically pleasing. And at the same time that's happening, we've got the bit being created for wing number 2, currently in our rewarming chamber, coming up to temp. And with that, wing number 2 has been added. Again, that metal tool, that metal tong, cools off the surface of the glass very, very quickly. So we got to get it back in for another flash heat, bring things back up to a good working temperature. Once we're happy with that, we get it back to the center bench and continue to shape up our dragon form. All right, getting ready to knock this piece away. We're going crunch, crunch, crunch on that little constriction. We're going to drop it in the tray. And from that tray, we're going to go from the bench to the garage. Again, 1,000 degrees internal temperature in that garage. It's hot enough to keep our glass objects ready, but not hot enough to keep them liquidy. So they'll sit in there for the remainder of the afternoon until we get ready to use them. And in much the same way, we're going to go ahead and start another one of these dragon stoppers. That begins with a gather of clear glass on the end of a punty rod. You shape it up into somewhat of a rod, just to give us a little bit more surface area when we make another trip to that crucible. We're able to gather just a bit more hot glass. So into that 2,100 degree crucible for a gather of clear glass. And then we make a trip through that chipped up colored glass on the table. In this particular case, it's a lovely golden color. And once we're happy with the amount of frit, that chipped up glass we were just talking about, once we're happy with enough of that on the outside of it, we get it into that rewarming chamber. Make sure that it melts into the surface of that gather of clear glass that we had. And once it gets up to temp, we're going to go ahead and drop that entire thing down into an optic mold. It's going to impart some surface texture into our glass form. Then we get it back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over heat to the skin of our glass form. And then using those metal tools on our bench, we're going to tease this object out into something much longer and much more serpentine. Now, in order to give us this scale pattern that we're used to seeing on our dragon skins, what we're going to do is we're going to run this form into the reheating chamber just to give it another nice flash to its skin. At the same time, we've got another gather of clear glass coming out of the crucible, getting ready to add a wrap. So we'll wrap that around the body of this dragon, or what will become the body of the dragon. I'm going to bring that glass out. Quick tack. We're going to pull back just a little bit, stretch things out, and now we spin, spin, spin. And with the application of that wrap, we get back into the rewarming chamber to make sure that all of that glass melts into the surface, creates a nice perfect bond, and gives us that beautiful scaly texture we're used to seeing. So as we curl this tail around, we're going to begin the process of adding bits to our sculpture. In this particular case, we're going to be adding a colored piece of glass to the tail and turning that into a couple of fins. We're going to finish refining the basic shape of our dragon form before we start that process, though. All right, with the tail coiled around, we'll get back into the rewarming chamber. Meanwhile, just to the right of Ben, we've got Eden picking up some more of that colored chipped up frit on the outside of her gather of clear glass. Once that frit has melted into the surface of that gather, she'll then present it here at the center bench. We'll add it and turn that into a couple of tail fins. All right, with that first bit added, and after a little bit more fine tuning, we're going to add a small gather of glass to the very bottom of that tail. It'll give us a little bit more meat on the bones, if you will, when we get ready to move this dragon form from the pipe or from the punty rod on which it sits to the new punty that Eden is creating right now. Excuse me, Eden is bringing that gather of glass while that punty is being made. And now that we have inverted that piece, the coldest portion of the glass is furthest into that rewarming chamber. So we've got to bring it up to a working temperature. It's going to require a little bit more time in that rewarming chamber than we have been spending. We're going to focus that blast furnace type property, focusing the heat right at the very end of that dragon form. Get it nice and orange, malleable, and floppy so that we can continue to shape it up. All right, we've got Nick, who is working on another bit to be added to our dragon form. In this particular case, this is going to be one of the dragon's arms and claws. So we'll tweeze that out, pull it down, snip it off so we have a very nice thin filament to be added to the dragon. We go from the shoulder to the elbow back up to the wrist, leaving a little bit of a tag that we can then turn into a dragon's claw. And then we get it back into the rewarming chamber for another flash heat, bringing it all back up to a good workable temperature. Continue refining that claw. And as he's working on the claw, Nick will then start another bit with a clear glass gather from our crucible. Make a trip through that colored frit on the table. We'll heat it up, make sure everything is nice and liquidy. And in much the same way we did just a second ago, we're going to present that bit and create the arm and claw on the opposite side. And we've gotten both of the arms added, which means our next bit is going to be the mane down the neck of the dragon. Same way we've been doing it. We take a gather of clear glass, add a layer of colored frit to the outside. We heat it up, make sure it's nice and soft, smooth, and then we present it for an addition, in this particular case, to the neck of our dragon form. Snip that away, and using our tongs, we'll add a few sculptural elements into that mane. And we'll take a quick run back to that rewarming chamber for another all-over flash heat. All right, our dragon has a face and hands, but doesn't have eyeballs, so that's what we're going to add next. Using our map gas torch to bring those items up to a good temperature where they'll stick together. Once that join has been created, we get it back into the rewarming chamber, as you see. Make sure that the connection between those eyeballs and the dragon's head is perfect. Once we're happy with the thermal energy in the end of that dragon form, we'll get it back here to the bench, continue shaping up, waiting for the addition of our last two bits in our wings that will be added here within the next few minutes. And there we have the addition of wing number 1. Using those tongs to shape those wings cools off the surface of that glass really, really quick. So we have to get it into our rewarming chamber. Make sure the skin of that wing form is up to temperature, and then we will tease it out just a little bit. While that's happening, we've got Eden there at our marvering table, preparing the next bit for adding to the back of our dragon. All right, and with our artist paying attention to that moil, or the connection point between our punty and our dragon form, it's a good indicator that we're getting ready to knock this piece away and put it in the tray that Nick is carrying. Once we put it away, it'll go over here into this silver box just to my left-hand side. We call that the garage. Keep it in there and keep it in a ready state at about 1,000 degrees so we can use a little later on. A quick tap there. Leaves it in the tray. Again, back into the garage for a 1,000-degree temperature bath. And while it sits in there for the remainder of the evening, we're going to start one more of our dragon bits. So again, we start with a core of clear glass. We're going to add another layer of clear glass onto the outside of it. And while we've got it nice and hot straight out of the crucible, we're going to roll it in that bowl full of chunked up or chipped up colored glass called frit. In this particular case, our frit is a nice gold color. When we've got enough of that in the surface of our gather, we're going to get it back into our rewarming chamber, melt everything into the surface, and then we're going to drop it down into an optical mold on the floor. It's going to emboss some striations in the surface of what will become our dragon's body. So now that all that frit is hot and melted into the surface, into that optic mold we go. And because that optic mold is so cold on the outside, it chills the glass very, very quickly. So we put it immediately back into the rewarming chamber for an all-over heat, what we call a flash, just to get the skin of that object moving again. And then we'll use a selection of metal tools there on our side bench to tweeze and coax that glob of glass out into something more usable, something a bit more serpentine. All right, so we've got the vertical striations along our dragon's body, but what we need is some horizontal striations so that when it cools down, it reads as if it were dragon scale. So what we're going to do here is we're going to heat up the surface of the form on which we're working. At the same time, one of our interns is going to get a nice gather of hot, clear glass from our crucible. Remember, those crucibles are 2,100 degrees and hold 1,000 pounds of glass 24/7 in that liquid state. We're going to move back from the crucible, and with a quick tap, we're going to pull back just a bit, creating a thin filament of glass. And then we will spin, spin, spin. Oh, I wouldn't stand in the freaking splash zone. All right, and with the application of that wrap, we've gone deep back into the rewarming chamber, making sure that the wrap has been fused to the body of that dragon. And once we've got it all up to temperature, we'll take a seat back in the bench and continue to work on shaping up that dragon form. So we've got the tail curled up, and we've got another bit of colored glass being presented here. Going to tack that quickly to the tail, a little snip. We're going to separate those two, or separate that into two pieces. And then we're going to use our tongs to turn them into something akin to tail fins. And we'll return the entire thing to the rewarming chamber for another flash heat, keeping our glass form above that 1,000-degree critical temperature. So our next step, folks, is we got to move this object from this punty rod onto another one on the opposite side of our dragon form so that we can continue working on the upper body of this dragon. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a small layer of clear glass right to the very bottom of our dragon's tail. That's going to give us a little bit more material, so that when we add our punty rod to the bottom, we don't risk damaging the glass underneath it. So we're going to get back into that rewarming chamber for another all-over heat, a quick flash. While at the marvering table, we're having our punty made. And we get ready to trade these two items between the rods. You'll see one rod being presented and tacked to the tail. Meanwhile, our artist there in the bench will use some of his shears on that constriction point, creating some cracks right off the end of that punty rod. And then with a quick tap, he'll separate it from his rod, leaving it on our interns. We'll then get that entire object back into the rewarming chamber so that we can heat up the coldest portion of the glass and bring it up to a good working temperature so we continue adding bits and refining the shape of our dragon. With the addition of those two claws, we have created the mane that will go down the back of the dragon's neck. I'm presenting that here at the center bench now. A quick snip, and the application of those tongs. We can throw in some design elements, and then get back into the rewarming chamber before everything gets too cold. All right, the next bit to be added is right there at the very end of the neck. So we're turning this into the dragon's face. Everybody knows that dragons have to have eyes in order to be able to see. And our dragon currently lacks those eyeballs. So one of the next steps we're going to do is we're going to come over here to this big silver box called the garage. We're going to pull a tray out of here, and that tray has some pre-made dragon's eyes that we put together earlier. Hot glass really only likes to stick to other things, so we have to get our eyeballs up to a nice hot working temperature. So the inside of that garage sits at about 1100 to 1300 degrees. It keeps our glass in a ready state so they will stick together. You can see that addition to the dragon's face now. Using that MAP gas torch to really focus some of that thermal energy, make sure that the bond between our dragon's face and its eyes are 100%. And with the addition of those two little bits, we get back into the rewarming chamber, melt the outside, and make sure that that bond is 100%. Our dragon form looks pretty good at this point, but it's missing some of the quintessential things that make a dragon just that. So we'll be adding a couple of wings here over the next 5 or 10 minutes. In much the same way we've been adding the other bits to our dragon form. It starts with a gather of clear glass from our crucible. And that clear glass makes a trip through the frit, that colored chipped up glass there in the bowl on the table. Then we get into the rewarming chamber to melt everything in. And when everything is up to temperature, we'll move from that rewarming chamber back to the bench and add the first of 2 wings. Now those tongs, they chill the outside of that glass very, very quickly. It keeps it from moving, so we have to get back into that rewarming chamber and get the skin of that wing form moving again. Doing so will enable us to tweeze it out into something a bit more aesthetically pleasing. And get that back into the rewarming chamber for another flash heat, while Eden puts the finishing touches on the next bit that will be added, which is wing number 2. All right, folks, we're going to get ready to put this form away very soon. Really quickly, Nick is going to move back from our garage to that center bench with a plate, with a tray, and present it. And then Ben will use the shears on that constriction point just off the end of the punty rod. And he'll chomp, 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 and with a quick tap of his tools, it'll leave that dragon form in the tray that Nick is currently carrying. Just take a quick gander at that and see what we've been working on all evening. And back into the rewarming chamber for another flash heat. Try and bring the surface of that object up to a good homogeneous temperature. And once he's happy, we'll get it back to the bench using the MAP gas torch on that moil on the connection point, making sure that when we break this piece away, it comes away cleanly. There we go, chomp, chomp, chomp. And quick tap. There we go. Another one taken care of. Yeah, let's hear it for the Hot Shop team, folks. And with that, folks, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin here in the next couple of minutes, so I'm out of here. I'll leave you in capable hands of my replacement. Again, we will be doing the third Thursday event here at the museum. Runs from 5 to 8. It's a free event if you'd like to stick around. We also have this evening concert in the Cone from 6